Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone to the webinar to launch the new e-learning course on deep-sea fisheries management in areas beyond the national jurisdiction. Thank you for joining us. We have prepared for you a very interesting and rich program with high-level experts who will be sharing their insights. So we will be starting with our colleague Victoria Vargas Lences, who is the Global Coordinator of the Common Oceans Program. Victoria, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes. We can't hear you, Victoria. You're muted. Yes.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It is nice to see the growing number of participants online. And I would like to start by saying that on behalf of Dr. Vera Agostini, I would like to express her apologies for her absence. She regrets that she cannot be here today with us. But it is a pleasure for me to welcome you to this international technical webinar, which is jointly hosted by the Common Oceans Program and the FAO e-Learning Academy. The session ahead will provide you with valuable insights on deep-sea fisheries and its management in the areas beyond national jurisdiction. The ocean is critical for our planet's health and our own survival. Its areas beyond national jurisdiction are large and no single country has responsibility for them. In fact, all countries are collectively responsible. These areas, however, have an important role in providing food and ecosystem services, but they are subject to a number of challenges, such as overexploitation, habitat loss, pollution, and adverse effects of climate change. Despite representing only a modest portion of the global fish harvest when compared to small and large pelagic fisheries, for example, deep-sea fisheries remain a priority due to their economic benefits, providing employment, sustenance, and livelihoods. Their sustainable management is in our focus, as many species targeted by these fisheries are characterized by slow growth and maturation, and they can be vulnerable to high fishing pressure, as well as due to the impacts some of the fishing gears have on the seafloor during their harvesting. FAO has been actively engaged in addressing these challenges associated with deep-sea fisheries for around 20 years. It has been targeting, in particular, international cooperation, sustainable management practices, and balancing economic interests with environmental conservation. These efforts are in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, and they contribute to Blue Transformation, which is FAO's vision for transforming aquatic food systems. The Blue Transformation proposes a series of actions to promote the resilience of aquatic food systems and to ensure that fisheries and aquaculture grow sustainably. It aims to leave no one behind, especially communities that depend on the sector. Since 2022, the Common Oceans Program, with funding from the Global Environment Facility, has launched a new project to address deep-sea fishing. Today's webinar is part of that project. Achieving sustainable management of fisheries and biodiversity conservation in the areas beyond national jurisdiction is extremely difficult, given the complexity of the ecosystems, as well as the many and diverse actors involved. The Common Oceans Program is not confined to any specific nation or region, as the high seas are under the shared purview of all countries. It is a truly global program. a broad partnership of international organizations, private sector, civil society organizations, and academic initiatives collaborate in different capacities, of course, to achieve the common objective of sustainable use and biodiversity conservation. The overarching goal of this program is to support transformational change for the global management of the areas beyond national jurisdiction. Within this context, in the upcoming 4 years, the Deep-sea Fisheries project aims to bolster sustainable fishing practices of deep-sea fisheries. It will focus on promoting discussion, raising awareness in general, and in particular, sharing information among the regional fisheries management organizations, RFMOs, that manage these fisheries. We want to ensure that these fisheries are managed under both an ecosystem approach and a precautionary approach. We will focus on data-limited stocks, deep water sharks, and vulnerable marine ecosystems. Finally, I would like to briefly introduce you the agenda. We will have 25 minutes presenting our new e-learning course on strengthening deep-sea fisheries management. This will be followed by a presentation of our new publication on the progress of the implementation of the international guidelines for the management of deep-sea fisheries. This was a publication which was adopted in 2008, quite some time ago. And following these presentations, we will hear from 2 regional fisheries management organizations, the General Fisheries Commission for the Mediterranean and the South Pacific Regional Fisheries Management Organization on their successes and challenges. And last but not least, we will end the webinar with a question and answer session, where you are invited to share your questions through the dedicated function of Zoom. You can see the Q&A sign on the bottom menu of your screen. I would like to conclude by thanking you for your interest in deep-sea fisheries and for participating in this webinar. I encourage you to engage actively with the panelists and to take full advantage of the chance to share knowledge and to learn from one another. We hope you will enjoy this webinar and look forward to your questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Victoria, for the introduction. So we would like to this session to be very interactive. So to participants, please do ask your questions in the Q&A, as Victoria was mentioning. I would like now to give the floor to my colleague Esther Hidas, who is a deep-sea fisheries project manager, who will be describing the course as well as the associated publication. Esther, the floor is yours. You have about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see so many people joining us today. And indeed, I'd like to begin by presenting you a little bit the Deep-sea Fisheries Project, which is the project through which we have organized this webinar in collaboration with the FAO e-Learning Academy. So firstly, a little bit of an introduction about why do we work on deep-sea fisheries. Many of you on this webinar might be very familiar with fisheries, deep-sea fisheries, others maybe less so. So firstly, as Victoria mentioned, one of the characteristics of deep-sea fisheries is that many species have a slow growth, slow maturation, they live longer time or longer years, and they're not always very successful at reproducing every year because of the cold, dark environment they live in. So they are quite susceptible to overfishing. Their populations don't recover easily or quickly. And the other problem with, well, no problem, the other management challenge with deep sea fisheries is that many times the gear used either comes close to or touches the sea floor. So it has the potential to have impacts on other organisms that live on the sea floor, such as deep sea corals and sponges. These communities are collectively referred to as vulnerable marine ecosystems. And this is why we work on deep sea fisheries, is for these two reasons: to ensure that deep sea fisheries are sustainable and that we're able to reduce or limit the impacts on the seafloor. And now deep sea fisheries do only make up a small fraction of catches, but some of them do have are highly valuable. So we do have to ensure that they are harvested in a sustainable manner. And another challenge is that we are, due to their location and their difficulty to collect information of these species, we still know quite limited amounts of information on these fisheries. So with these three challenges, this provides us really the context for why we are working on deep sea fisheries through this project. And we are guided by the Deep Sea Fisheries Guidelines, or in a longer version, International Guidelines for the Management of Deep-sea Fisheries in the High Seas, which was adopted in 2009 by FAO, and which really gives us the context within or the guidance through which to work in our project. And you will hear much more about these guidelines from our colleague Tony, who will present on it in a later presentation. Moving a little bit onto the project itself. So as Victoria mentioned, we are very thankful for the generous funding of the Global Environmental Facility for this project. And it is implemented by FAO, but executed by the General Fisheries Commission for the Mediterranean. And we are also partners to all the RFMOs, or Regional Fisheries Management Organizations, that have a mandate to manage deep sea fisheries. And I won't go through all the acronyms, I'll just show them on the screen. So we have, as I mentioned, the General Fisheries Commission for the Mediterranean that manages deep sea fisheries in the Mediterranean. NAPO, which manages fisheries in the Northwest Atlantic, NIAFC in the Northeast Atlantic, NPFC, the North Pacific, SPRIFMO, the South Pacific, CFO, which is the West Atlantic, CIOFO in the Indian Ocean. And we also informally collaborate with CAMLAR, which is not an RFMO, which has a wider mandate of managing all living marine resources in the Antarctic Ocean, and we do loosely collaborate with them as well. And apart from that, we have also the government body NOAA from USA, and the scientific advisory body, the International Council for the Exploration for the Sea, and two private sector organizations, CIODFA and ICFA. So as you can see, the project really is a very partnership approach, and we really aim to catalyze all the fantastic experience and expertise and knowledge from these partners to sustainably manage deep sea fisheries. Moving on to the objective of the project, as mentioned already by Victoria, the emphasis here is to ensure that deep sea fisheries are managed under an ecosystem approach by the end of the project. And we are focusing on impacts on deep water sharks, vulnerable marine ecosystems, and also focusing on improving information and assessment of data limited stocks. There are three key areas of work. We work on strengthening and implementing regulatory frameworks, improving deep sea fisheries management, and reducing environmental impacts. So moving on now to presenting a little bit on the two key feature publications that we would like to present to you today. As already mentioned, in the first instance, we're going to spend some time talking about the e-learning course and its content and how it can be used. And the second part will be looking at the review of the implementation of the Deep Sea Fisheries Guidelines. So the Deep Sea Fisheries Management course, entitled Strengthening Deep Sea Fisheries Management in Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, has now been published and is free for all to use on the FAO e-Learning Academy website. The course basically provides an introductory level knowledge necessary to sustainably manage deep sea fisheries in the areas beyond national jurisdiction. It consists of 5 lessons, and it should take about 2 hours and 15 minutes to complete from beginning to end. And it is really relevant for wide audiences. It's tailored to have quite simple language, and most technical terms are explained correctly so that it can be used by fisheries experts, policymakers, parliamentarians, fishing operators, even media, and those generally working within the fishing sector. The first lesson is an introduction to deep sea fisheries. It talks about the biological characteristics of deep sea fisheries and their habitat. It talks about the status of the current status of the stocks and challenges associated with the management of deep sea fisheries. The second lesson is about the international obligations and responsibilities for the management of deep sea fisheries. And this lesson provides a full overview of the international fisheries instruments that are related to the management of deep sea fisheries. And it also touches on the global environmental instruments related to the management of deep sea fisheries. The third lesson is basically addressing the regional approach to fisheries management. And here we explain the role of regional fisheries management organizations and how they are established. We talk about the structure of RFMOs and the role of the different committees. We talk about the roles of RFMO contracting parties and also cooperating non-contracting parties and observers. And we provide an example of how an advice decision process proceeds. Lesson 4 starts going into the role of states at national level. And the first section, this lesson 4, talks about the national policy and legal considerations. And here we talk about the key measures to include in national policy and the legal framework for the sustainable management of deep sea fisheries, and the steps necessary to establish effective policy and legal frameworks at national level. And finally, lesson 5 looks at, again, the role of states at national level, but in terms of monitoring, control and surveillance and enforcement. So here we talk about the key national MCS and enforcement measures that need to be addressed, and the steps required to implement MCS and enforcement measures for deep sea fisheries at national level. So I hope this has given you a little bit of an overview of the content of the deep sea fisheries e-learning course, as well as the structure within which we are providing these 2 publications or tools for you. And I would finally like to thank again everyone for joining, and pass back to Christina for the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Esther. I would like to now, so since we were talking about the FAO e-learning academy that hosts all the courses, I wanted to give you a brief overview of what the academy is and what it consists in and what it offers. So some of the questions, I can see also that some of the participants were asking if the courses are free. So I wanted to mention that the FAO e-learning academy that hosts also the deep sea fisheries course offers free multilingual e-learning courses to anyone at any time, anywhere in the world. The idea is really to have a global public good that is offered to everyone with the purpose to transfer skills and competences. The entire academy, the courses are all aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And as for the deep sea fisheries course, all the other courses are always designed and developed using a collaborative approach. The Academy works with over 500 partners worldwide, including those mentioned by Esther in her presentation. And it is really a collaborative effort to support professionals worldwide. And we have reached now a global audience of over 1 million learners worldwide. What we are trying to do is...
Christina?
Yes?
Sorry, I was just checking if you are going to the next slide.
Yes, can you see the
Okay.
next slide?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So our intention is to support universal education. So allow anyone in the world to have access as a global public good to these resources. It's to provide equal rights to education. We are supporting digital and social inclusion. So even in areas with the marginalized individuals, with conflict, post-conflict, everybody needs to have the same equal rights to education. And we are using a system that is climate and environment friendly. We are also trying to bridge the gap between formal and informal education. What we mean by that is that we have developed a certification system that I will be talking to you about. In fact, the deep sea fisheries course is certified, and it is a certification of competences that we grant once the learner finishes and succeeds in the final test. As I mentioned, this is a huge collaborative effort, and we work with UN, with development agencies, but also with universities and academic institutions. We have actually developed many master's and postgraduate degrees where the universities integrate the courses as part of their learning program. We also work a lot with private sector, with NGOs and CSOs. And I wanted to conclude by giving you a bit more information on the certification. The certification we are granting is a UN official certificate of competences. And it is a visible, transparent, verifiable, shareable system that we are using. So what does it mean? It means that if you pass the final test that is associated to the course, you earn a digital badge that can follow you in your LinkedIn, in your e-portfolio, in your CV. It becomes part of your pool of competences. It is a way to demonstrate the competences acquired through the course. And behind the digital badge, so behind the graphical element, we store all the metadata. So you have your name, the date, the competences acquired, the name of the title of the course, etc. We have all a series of metadata associated. So it is an official certification. And these are some examples of badges that we have designed. And I wanted to conclude by telling you that this is the link to the FAO e-learning academy, where you can find a number of courses related to fisheries and other thematic areas, as well as a number of publications. So thank you very much for your time and your attention. And I would like now to pass the floor to Anthony Thompson, who is a deep sea fisheries expert, who will be describing a little bit what the guidelines on the management of deep sea fisheries. Anthony, the floor is yours. You have about 15 minutes.
Thank you. Let me try to share my screen. Oh, that didn't work. Share, let's share that one. Do you see the presentation now, or?
Yes.
Is it in full screen mode, or?
Yeah, everything is fine. Yes.
Full screen.
Everything's perfect. That's good. That's a good start then. Thank you for attending, and let me introduce fairly quickly the review that we recently undertook on the implementation of the international guidelines for the management of deep sea fisheries. And the guidelines themselves are illustrated on the top right. They were adopted in 2008, and the review was published actually just last week, I think. Ooh. Let's just go over a little bit of the recent history of some of the deep sea fisheries and why the guidelines was actually developed and adopted in the first place. In the 1970s to 1990s, there were quite a few unsustainable fishing activities, particularly by distant water fleets. And this arose because of improvements in electronic fish finding gear, sonars. So they could detect very large aggregations of fish in very deep waters. These were very old senescent fish. And as the graph shows, they quickly fished them out to very low levels. These fisheries were not sustainable. And in the 1990s to 2000s, there was a lot of the world summits. There was very great interest in sustainably using the oceans and reducing effects on biodiversity. The concerns, as Esther mentioned, short-lived, high-effort fisheries. We really want our fisheries to be long-lived and low-effort. Slow-growing, long-lived species, and that can be the fish that we catch, or it could be species that we impact on. And this results in biodiversity loss, which in the last 20 years has become a topic globally on the land and in the oceans. This slide has been partly mentioned, but I just wanted to quickly enforce that there is control of fishing in the high seas. It's not a lawless area. The high seas, although they're outside of national jurisdictions, they are the responsibility of all of us and all states collectively. And this is controlled through international treaties or agreements. And on the map on the right, you see that almost all of the ocean, and certainly all the areas where they have significant high seas bottom fishes, are covered by management organizations. These management organizations comprise of between, I think, 5 states for the smallest one and maybe 30 or 40 states for the largest ones. They provide scientific advice to help manage the fisheries, and they adopt binding fisheries management measures, which are rules to control how many fish can be caught, what types of gear can be used, so on and so forth. It's too easy to get lost in the detail of all this, but there has been absolutely dramatic changes that have happened in the last 20 years. If we look at simply the management bodies, the top 2 maps there, in the year 2000, we had just 4 management bodies covering the high seas areas. The high seas areas are really the middle of the oceans, outside of the little grey lines that you can just see that surround all the land. In 2024, we now have almost all the high seas covered. It is an incredible transformational change that was stimulated by various UN activities and by the deep sea fisheries guidelines. If we look at the bottom pair of maps, we focus on the bottom fishable areas. In 2000, anybody could fish anywhere in the high seas. There were no rules controlling where fisheries were. And actually, we didn't know where a lot of the fisheries were even happening. It was not useful information for us to collect at that time. If we jump forward 20 years, we see the green areas where you can fish. You can hardly actually see them at the scale of that map. They are there, but they're a very tiny proportion of the high seas. The orange areas are where there is no current fishing in the high seas, so most of the high seas are not fished. The red areas, particularly prominent in the Atlantic, are areas closed to bottom fishing to protect vulnerable marine ecosystems, and I'll explain a little bit more about those later. So the FAO Deep Sea Fisheries Guidelines, they're internationally adopted at FAO in 2008 by its 160-odd member countries. They deal with the management of bottom contact fishing gears. So we're looking at fisheries that happen on or very close to the bottom, down between 200 and 2,000 meters depth. 2,000 meters, that's 2 kilometers under the surface. They're concerned with the catch of long-lived, slow-growing species. The fish there, you have a Alfonsino and a crabs. Crabs are also important deep water fisheries. They're very slow to reproduce. They're susceptible to overfishing. And on the right at the bottom, we see 2 types of organisms that live on the seafloor, corals and sponges. Both can take hundreds and hundreds of years to grow. The voluntary guidelines also support the Law of the Seas Convention, which is the convention that governs humans' activities on all of our oceans. Voluntary guidelines, they're very, very important, and they're very well taken up in the most case, and they all do support the international treaties. So quickly on to the development of the implementation review. And you really have to look at this to see the details, and the link will be provided to you. This is just ever such a brief summary. We've looked at the uptake of measures being rules adopted to control fisheries that are required to implement the deep sea fisheries guidelines that were adopted in 2008. And we split this into 3 different topics: fishery assessments, the fish that we catch, eat or discard; vulnerable marine ecosystems, which is what is living on the sea floor and what is impacted if fishing gears pass over them. Trawls, long lines, pots, they can all impact on corals and sponges and other sensitive organisms. And to tie these 2 together, we looked at monitoring, control and surveillance, which is really how the regulations are policed, enforced and ensuring that they do happen. The review provides a lot of examples of what we considered good practice. And I'm not going to cover these in this short presentation, but if you go to the review, you will see that there are, well, not hundreds, but certainly 50, I think, good practice examples covering the various topics that we reviewed. So let's look at fishery assessments. The interesting thing about fishery assessments is the deep sea fisheries guidelines very much includes the control of deep sea fisheries, but the uptake has been much more towards impacts on biodiversity and on bottom habitats. So the average uptake for fisheries assessments, we monitored at 52% or scored at 52% for the 6 indicators. The success stories were the setting of target catch limits in the last 20 years, defining where people are allowed to fish, that was the green areas on the map, and also restrictions on any newer fisheries, and that was the orange areas on that map. The future challenges, really controlling the catches of our non-target species. They can either be minor commercial species that are landed, or they can be discarded species like deep water sharks is a focus for the project. We don't only focus on deep water sharks. We do include the others, but the deep water ones are the sharks are the ones we think are most vulnerable. Reference points and the use of reference points tell you when something is going wrong, a limit reference point, our stocks are too low, or a target for the future. Where do we want to be in 20 years' time? Where do we want our stocks to be? What level do we want? What catch do we want? And that leads into the long-term management plans. And we'll hear a little bit more about that in the Mediterranean later on. Vulnerable marine ecosystems, these beautiful animals that live down at, well, they live on shallow coral reefs, but ours are down at 200 to 2,000 meters, and they go down to 3,500 meters. This has been a real success story of the deep sea fisheries guidelines. There's corals and sponges, and there's several other organisms as well, but the main focus really has been on these corals and sponges, which are attached to the sea floors, and they may be 2, 3, 4 meters high. Setting encounter thresholds, so we know when a vessel is fishing in a VME and should take avoiding action, avoiding the impacts caused by fisheries, and that's done mainly by VME closures. There are other ways. There's modifying the gears, but the main and the best way to protect these beautiful habitats is by closing them to bottom fisheries. And identification guides. The people on fishing vessels are good at identifying fish, but when it comes to these corals and sponges, it's a real challenge. And FAO has been particularly active in helping to develop identification guides. The future challenges, I've written reporting encounters. That's maybe not the best wording. The fishing gears are not particularly good at sampling, i.e. bringing up on the deck corals and sponges. So it is a challenge to know when we are fishing there with the use of some gears. You get some brought up, but that remains to be a challenge. And just identifying where these VMEs are at 200 to 2000 meters. You can't go out with a butterfly net or a pair of binoculars and find them. It's awfully expensive and difficult to know where they are. The monitoring, control and surveillance. So just to bring it all together, and are people abiding by the rules? Our FMOs are particularly good and particularly strong at monitoring, control and surveillance, often targeted more at the fish species they land, but it does include all aspects. Vessel monitoring systems started in about 2010, and it's using satellites to track where the vessels are fishing. That has been a tremendous transformational change in the last 15 years. And various fishing vessel lists, I've just listed two here, vessels that have permission to fish and what they can catch and what gears they use, and also lists of illegal, unreported and unregulated vessels, vessels which have been infringing the rules and are put on a list which will prohibit them from landing in certain ports under the FAO Port State Measures Agreement. The future challenges, more detailed haul level catch reporting. It's good for the target species that are kept on the boat and landed, but it's difficult for those which are discarded over the side. That needs to be worked. Catch and transshipment verification has always been a challenge, and it is getting much, much better with the modern electronic tools, electronic monitoring, VMS, etc. And the efficient use of onboard observers. Most of these vessels on the high seas have to carry independent observers, and their tasks are very, very busy and very, very many. So that scored well, 75% for our 6 indicators. So that is an awfully quick run through of the review. I encourage you to look at the review, absolutely look at the e-learning course, or courses in plural. There are many, many on the FAO website. We hope that the review will support future uptake and solve some of the difficult areas. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Anthony. And I would like now to give the floor to Miguel Bernal, who's the Executive Secretary of the General Fisheries Commission for the Mediterranean. Miguel, the floor is yours. You have about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here for this important event. I would like now to present a little bit the work that we are doing, particularly in the Mediterranean, even if our commission also covers the Black Sea. As you may know, the Black Sea has very specific conditions and there is no deep sea fishing in this area. So my presentation is going to be structured on 3 topics. The first one is the efforts that we are doing for the management of deep sea fisheries in the GFCM area. The second one will be about protecting vulnerable marine ecosystems. And the third one is activities that we are doing for improving data collection on deep sea sharks, in general of sharks, but in particular on deep sea sharks. So in a way, what I will be providing now is a bit of a zoom in on the guidelines and the work that Tony Thompson was presented previously to this presentation. So starting a little bit with the management aspects, I would like to first introduce to you what does deep sea fishing means for Mediterranean area. This is a very particular area in which the deeps can reach very high, and most of the fisheries are shared between our countries. So the countries have decided that deep sea fishing in our region is not based on the jurisdiction of the waters, but is based on a combination between the fishing gear, target species, and the depths being operated by these different fleets. The 2 main aspects of the definition of deep sea fisheries in our region are fishing vessels above 15 meters, operating with bottom contact fishing gear, fishing for deep water red shrimps or other kind of shrimps that are frequent in these depths, or also all fishing vessels that operate with bottom contact gears that are known to be operated at depths deeper than 300 meters. Just for you to understand what part of the fleet are we talking about, the GFCM area is dominated clearly by small-scale fisheries that account 82% of the total fleet. Out of the other 18% of the fleet, around 2% of the vessels operate in these deep sea fishing activities. So how do we manage these fishing activities? Currently, the GFCM has been adopting multi-annual management plans, and multi-annual management plans, as this was mentioned as well by Tony, are usually adopted as binding recommendations. They are compulsory for all of the fleets operating in our region. These management plans typically focus on large-scale fisheries and shared stocks, and usually they all specify adaptive mechanisms that allows the fisheries managers to obtain the results they want to obtain. They have increasingly taken a more participatory and collaborative approach, and this is very important because the opinion of the sectors and the different stakeholders has been taken into account when adopting these plans, and usually they are implemented in two stages. A first transitional phase, where some initial measures are adopted while the knowledge is being improved, and a second phase that have long-term adaptive measures in place. Currently, there are 10 multi-annual management plans in the GFCM area of application, and I will focus this presentation mainly on 4 of them. 3 of them dedicated to deep water red shrimps in the central and eastern Mediterranean area, and 1 dedicated to European hake and deep water roach shrimps. These 4 management plans involve around 2,000 vessels. Focusing in on the measures that are included into these management plans, as I said, all of them are organized into this transitional period and long-term management plans. They are all very recent. So the transitional period is in between 2023 and 2025. They are quite comprehensive. So they include catch limits, they include spatio-temporal measures, minimal conservation reference size, monitoring, control, and surveillance measures, and as it was mentioned before, international inspection schemes. And these are very important to ensure that the different rules in the management plans are being implemented. They're all based on the fact that there is a strong scientific advice coming to understand and to monitor the status of resources. And they all aspire to have long-term adaptive management measures based on both the status of the stocks, but also by establishing the footprint of these fishing activities and making sure that significant adverse impacts are avoided by minimizing the overlap between this footprint and BME indicator species. Here you can see an example of the species that are being covered by these 3 management plans. As I say, the management plans are quite recent, and you see that most of the species being managed are currently on overexploitation. However, as you can see by the little green arrows, most of them are showing an improvement in the recent years, and we are quite close to the targets in some of them. So you see here, for example, for the first species, we have a ratio between the reference point of fishing mortality and the current fishing mortality that is 1.2. We would like to get to 1 or below, so we are close to that. In other cases, for example, the 3 species that you see here, we are still far away from it, and this requires that additional measures are being implemented to using this adaptive part of the management plans. I'm moving now to the second part of this quick presentation, which is about protecting vulnerable marine ecosystems. As Tony mentioned before, this is an important part of the management of deep-sea fisheries to avoid any significant adverse impact on these communities that are quite susceptible. So again, in the GFCM, we have a total of 10 fishery restricted areas. These 10 fishery restricted areas have different objectives, but in particular, 5 of them are dedicated to protect vulnerable marine ecosystems. There are 4 specific ones, and there is one very big area protected to bottom fishing activities, which is all the seabed below 1,000 meters in the Mediterranean. In addition to that, we have adopted very recently as well 3 technical protocols for the protection of vulnerable marine ecosystems. One is a BME encounter reporting protocol by which any fishing activity that encounters indicators of potential BMEs needs to report this information. The second one is a protocol for mapping existing deep-sea fishing areas. And the third one is a protocol for exploratory deep-sea bottom fishing reporting protocol. All of these protocols are now being implemented, in particular to protect ecosystems formed by Cnidaria, coral communities. And we have done this through a resolution that involves and requires countries to start transitionally implementing these 3 protocols. In addition to that, and this is also very important and very much in line with the deep sea fisheries guidelines, we have created a very important database on collecting all information from these protocols and from many other means, surveys at sea, voluntary contributions from dedicated expeditions, where we record any presence of BME indicators. This database currently have more than 20,000 records, and this is a scientific tool that allows our experts to provide advice to our commission on areas that are particularly important and are particularly susceptible and should be protected. Finally, let me move into the third part of the presentation, which is data collection on sharks. I have put here into brackets deep sea sharks because you will see that our protocols do not focus only on deep sea sharks, but they provide a means to collect information on any kind of vulnerable species, particularly sharks, and of course, also the deep sea ones. The GFCM has devoted in the recent years a large part of their efforts and their budget to ensure that all of the countries have a level playing field. They all have a minimal capacity to address their needs in terms of fisheries monitoring. And in order to do that, what we have done is we have prepared a number of guidelines and manuals that standardize the way the information should be collected. But also we have launched many different capacity development actions that ensure that this monitoring is happening, for example, through the presence of observers on board, through the presence or through the execution of dedicated surveys at sea. And all of these activities are currently also reflected in a dedicated regional plan of action addressing vulnerable species. The objective of this plan is to address incidental captures and any related fishing mortality of vulnerable species, but also address the issue of depredation from marine megafauna to the products of fishing activities. The regional plan of action covers monitoring, management, and capacity development activities, and it provides a very clear work plan to be implemented in the years to come, 2024 up to 2030. However, part of these activities have already been started even before the regional plan of action was adopted. And you can see here one of the first analyses that we have done on the GFCM through our report on the status of Mediterranean and Black Sea fisheries, where all of the fleets that contribute or that are responsible for incidental catch of different group of species are being identified. In this particular graph here, you can see the groups responsible for the higher contribution of incidental catches of elasmobranchs. And you can see that usually this refers to either bottom trawlers or the Mersenne longliners that are also affecting deep water sharks. In addition to launching these monitoring activities and to reflect vulnerabilities, of course, once particular areas are identified, the GFCM has also launched a number of pilot projects that address these high-risk areas and try to identify mitigation measures. We have projects such as mitigation measures for elasmobranchs in Western Mediterranean, in Central Mediterranean, in the Adriatic Sea, and also in the Eastern Mediterranean. And usually these projects first try to delve into the data and trying to have more precise information of the species affected, but also try to check mitigation measures that could include changes in the fishing gear, but it also could include the identification and areas that need to be protected. So very quickly, and to finalize my presentation, let me also touch on some of the challenges and future perspectives for this area. One of the things that the GFCM is working intensively to is to assess the effectiveness of these deep sea fisheries management plans. We know that some of the species that are being under management plans are doing much better. We would like to understand if in particular the deep sea fisheries management plans are being more or less effective than others and whether they should be modified accordingly. We need to ensure a level playing field among all of our countries in our region. For example, ensuring that we get information from vessel monitoring systems from all of the relevant vessels that are involved into this fishery. We also need to ensure the regular collection of data on BME indicators. You have seen that the database we have is really helping experts to try to identify priorities. We need to make sure that the data continues to arrive to this database. And we need to finalize the mapping of the deep sea fishing footprint and overlap it with these indicators of vulnerable marine ecosystems to make sure that we are protecting the right areas. Finally, and this is one of the objectives of the GFCM, as we have done for other kind of fisheries, we would like to make sure that the scientific observer program on deep sea fisheries is well established and all of the fishing activities in our region includes observers on board. And with that, I'm gonna stop my presentation and I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Miguel, for this overview. And I would like to now give the floor to Greg Loveridge, who is the Executive Secretary of the South Pacific Regional Fisheries Management Organization. So Greg, the floor is yours. You have about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be here to talk about the South Pacific Fisheries Management Organization. Just have to get myself a little bit organized. Not used to doing these presentations, so please bear with me. The SPFMO is one of several organizations, international regional fisheries bodies that can establish binding measures for the conservation and sustainable management of fisheries resources. At present, SPFMO has 17 members from the Americas, Asia, Europe, and Oceania, with 2 cooperating non-contracting parties. And as shown in the map, the SPFMO Convention applies to waters of the South Pacific Ocean beyond national jurisdiction. This slide shows the extent of the SPFMO area. The area is huge, being approximately 59 million square kilometres and covering over a quarter of the high seas ocean areas. The main commercial fisheries resources fished in Spripmo are jack mackerel and jumbo flying squid in the southeast, and various deep sea species in the southwest. Spripmo also has exploratory fisheries for crabs, lobsters, and toothfish, as shown on this slide. And the talk today is going to concentrate on the area in the square, being where most of the deep sea fisheries occur on the western side of the Pacific. Just a little bit more on the organisation as a whole, and to give a general structure of how many RFMOs are organised. Spripmo's decision-making body is the Commission, which meets annually during January and February each year. The Commission is supported by 3 subsidiary bodies in Spripmo. 2 of those also meet in the week prior to the Commission, whereas the Scientific Committee, which is shown in this slide, holds its annual meeting in the September and October of the preceding year. All of these bodies can set up temporary or permanent working groups to progress individual topics. And for example, the Scientific Committee has set up a permanent working group to progress science associated with deep sea fisheries. This working group generally meets in a virtual capacity and throughout the year. Now that you have some background on the organisation, I'm going to structure the remainder of the presentation actually using the 5 management and conservation steps which are drawn from the international guidelines themselves. You would have seen Tony talk about some of these, but these are the 5 topics that are under the management and conservation steps in the guidelines. And for each section, I'm going to highlight some of the associated successes that Spripmo has had and talk about various challenges that remain. In terms of data reporting and stock assessment, early on, Spripmo recognised that successful management relies on good information. In the deep water fisheries, individual tow or line information is actually submitted to the nearest 1/100th of a degree for the start and end of each event, along with catch information for all species caught. So we get very fine scale information on fishing events. We've also established our own observer program to collect verified scientific data and information related to fishing activities and their impacts on the marine environment. Providers of observer services are independently assessed against the accreditation standard, which includes elements such as observer independence, safety, training, and the duties of vessel operators, captains, and crew. Spripmo's overall size means that sampling is expensive in the high seas. It's a long way to go. It's logistically challenging. And this does mean for the Spripmo area, we have relatively limited ecological knowledge of the deep sea fauna in the area. We also have a lack of easily available socioeconomic data, which prevents easily assessing the economic status of fisheries and fishers, and even the effective management policies. These are some of the challenges. And in terms of data and reporting, by their nature, bottom fisheries often catch a wide variety of species, many of which can be rarely seen and hence are information poor. And the organisation as a whole has limited capacity to assess the large number of deep sea stocks. And so often we employ strategies to concentrate on species which have the highest amount of catches or those that we deem are most at risk. In terms of vulnerable marine ecosystems, identification and assessing significant adverse impacts, those are the acronyms at the top, Spripmo's developed a list of 11 groups of vulnerable marine ecosystem indicator species. You've heard colleagues talk about those before. And we also have associated identification guides to help for ATSI identification. For over 10 years, Spripmo has put a lot of work into developing its habitat suitability models. Since we don't have a lot of hard information showing us where VMEs are, we need to predict where those VMEs are likely to be, and we predict areas that are capable of supporting vulnerable marine ecosystems. Using those models of habitat suitability and alongside stakeholder impact and maps of historical fishing effort, Spripmo has been able to implement a spatial management approach that protects a large proportion of the predicted distribution of VME indicated taxa, and also provides assurance that bottom fishing would not have significant adverse impacts on in the remaining areas. The management regime utilises encounter rules or move-on rules as a backstop, and this has resulted in one additional closure due to a possible encounter with a VME. And recently, SWPMO also agreed to apply a minimum of 70% protection of suitable habitat for each model VME taxa. The success is above or reliant on the best available scientific information, but often, as with any model, they have uncertainties. And in this case, there are well-documented uncertainties, particularly associated with the habitat suitability models and how they might relate to actual distribution of VMEs, where these organisms might actually be instead of where they're predicted to be. And then we're also working on an encounter review standard to assess if VME encounters actually mean that there is a VME there or in the surrounding area, or whether that was expected encounters. So that's future work that we need to do. For context, I just wanted to bring up this slide. This shows the bottom fishing management areas in SWPMO on the western side. You can see that they're very, very small. They encompass a very small part of the area. And SWPMO does use 3 different management areas for 3 different methods. Moving on to the enforcement and compliance areas. SWPMO has a central VMS for all SWPMO authorised vessels. And in the SWPMO area, bottom fishing vessels report to that VMS every 30 minutes. We also have mandated observer coverage, 100% observer coverage for bottom trawls and 10% for bottom longlines. Some of these items you've heard others talk about before. SWPMO has established a record of vessels that shows which vessels are authorised to operate in SWPMO. And we have our own processes for identifying legal, unregulated or unreported and IUU vessels. And the point of difference is that the organisation does automatically recognise all of the other IUU lists that are produced by RFMOs. Recently, we've been able to establish port inspections and also a SWPMO-specific high seas boarding and inspection scheme that allows inspections to be conducted on fishing vessels in the SWPMO area safely and effectively. And another success in SWPMO is that we have a compliance monitoring scheme that assesses member compliance with our rules and regulations annually, and the results of that process are available publicly on our website. Some of the challenges in this area, I've mentioned the size. It's worth repeating in this context that monitoring such a huge area is obviously a challenge. Managing and standardizing the information gathered can be daunting, especially considering the quantity of information coming in. And effective follow-up actions can be complicated depending on when information becomes available and in seeking to ensure that any commitments made are verified and then communicated back to interested parties. Just in terms of the main management and conservation tools SWPMO has, here's a list of the main conservation management measures we use, specifically relating to bottom fisheries. And some of the newer decisions that we've taken include in 2023, SWPMO took a decision recognising the urgency of developing a comprehensive approach to understanding and addressing the impacts of climate change on fisheries resources. We're starting to begin that work. As reflected in the organisation's objectives, and there's a need to balance the long-term conservation and sustainable use of fisheries resources whilst continuing to safeguard the marine ecosystems in which those resources occur. This is an ongoing challenge. And all organisations need to consider their capacity when planning their activities. Many of the members who attend SWPMO meetings have national responsibilities or indeed responsibilities for other RFMOs in different areas. These people are often very dedicated but the list of needs can be long, and there's only 24 hours in a day. In terms of review, there's a section on assessment and review of the effectiveness of measures. SBRIPMO's bottom fishing measure has been reviewed 8 times since it was initially agreed in 2014. The latest version was agreed in 2023. We've also developed the bottom fishing impact assessment standard and updated that to account for scientific and management advances. Under the standard, regular impact assessments are carried out before being reviewed by the scientific committee, and those assessments and associated reviews are available on the website and help to inform management. I want to concentrate a little bit. In 2022, an intersessional working group was established to review the SBRIPMO bottom fishing measure. It considered 5 main topics, and it was open to all members and commission observers. The group met virtually 7 times before presenting its results in 2023. The review considered all of the scientific, legal, and management factors and documented advice provided to the Commission on these topics. It clearly documents the history of bottom fishing, CMM, and SBRIPMO, and areas for future work. It's a thorough view and is available via the website. The review noted that acknowledged that SBRIPMO measure aims to implement the UNGA resolutions, protect marine ecosystems, and prevent significant adverse impacts. But it explicitly acknowledged the complexity of this type of work, especially when you're working in deep sea and remote areas. The review noted that the bottom fishing work and the technical work that underpinned it will continue to be improved over time, and this is unavoidable in these situations and very common in fisheries. For my final comments, I just wanted to reflect a little bit on the progress that's been made since 2014 and the results of all of the work that we've been going through. I think it's fair to say that the UNGA resolutions have driven the development of SBRIPMO's deep sea management approach, and the deep sea guidelines, which we've been discussing today, have been referenced and used extensively by SBRIPMO to create an approach which we believe is based on the best available science and aims to sustainably manage deep sea stocks and protect vulnerable marine ecosystems from significant adverse impacts. The SBRIPMO management regime is reviewed regularly, and steps are taken to continually improve the management as our knowledge base grows. With that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention. Come to the end of my presentation, and I'll hand back to Christine.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Greg, for this thorough overview of all the challenges and opportunities and successes related to deep sea fisheries. We are now opening the floor for the Q&A session. So we would like to invite all participants to ask their questions, and we will do our best to respond. However, we will be preparing a document with all the questions and all the answers, and this will be published together with the recording and all the presentations on the FAO e-learning Academy website on the webinar section of the website. So now we open the floor, and my colleague Esther will be facilitating the Q&A session. Esther, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christina. And indeed, thank you very much for our participants for sending in some very, very interesting questions. As you can appreciate, we only have 20 minutes, so we will do a selection of the ones that have been shared, and any others that we are unable to address today, we will address through a document that we will share on the e-learning website. So I might just pick and choose a few very interesting ones and throw them to our panelists. And perhaps I'll begin with one from Muhammad Ali, and the question will go to Miguel. And the question reads, some countries cannot have access to deep sea fisheries for ability to conduct data collection. What is FAO's role to support deep sea fisheries as well as biodiversity management conservation? Please, Miguel.
Thank you, Esther, and thank you very much for this very important question. As I said a bit in my presentation, the GFCN, we devote an important part of our resources to launch these capacity development activities. Currently, we have a very big program called Med-Sea for Fish, and this big program, thanks to the support of the European Union, is allowing us to establish these monitoring programs. Through these programs, what we are doing is we are assisting countries to execute surveys at sea, to collect data in the ports, to perform socioeconomic questionnaires, for example, and to have observers on board on particular fishing activities. I completely agree that what is needed is that all of the countries at least have the capacity to understand the status of resources in their waters and to contribute to this general regional or sub-regional management of these fishing activities. As I mentioned in my presentation, all of the resources, and particularly deep sea resources in our region, are shared between countries. So all of the countries have an obligation and a responsibility to be able to manage their activities and to have the information. And if they need support, our organization is really investing a lot in trying to provide this capacity development support. In addition to that, as I said, we are a regional fisheries management organization inside FAO. I am aware that FAO have other programs, for example, the Nansen program, that provide assistance at larger scale and for other regions.
Thank you very much, Miguel, for that comprehensive answer. Of course, we could continue on many of these questions for a long time, but just for the interest of time and having some other areas discussed, I will move on now to Craig. There have been some specific questions asked about the SPRIFMO area, so I'm going to collect a few together. First one is what exploratory or new deep sea fisheries are taking place within the SPRIFMO Convention area? And also, are the CMMs available online? Yes, let's just keep it to those two for now.
Thank you for those questions. I'm very pleased that we got some interest. In terms of the CMMs, yeah, I have typed into the answer field where those CMMs can be found. They're all available online on the SPRIFMO website, which is sprfmo.int. So sprifmo.int. We have all of the information there, as well as other information about that I haven't presented about some of the reviews and assessments and the CMMs and the like. Coming now to the question on exploratory fisheries, we do have exploratory fisheries in SPRIFMO. The exploratory fisheries we have are also regulated by the CMMs in the same place. But briefly, we have an exploratory fishery for crabs and lobster, which has been occurring for a couple, 3 or 4 years now. And then we have a number of exploratory fisheries for toothfish. The toothfish exploratory fisheries are generally along the southern boundary of the SPRIFMO area, and that's a boundary that is near the Antarctic region. Of course, Antarctica is managed by CAMLA, the Antarctic region, but we have a shared boundary with them, and we have a number of exploratory fisheries on toothfish in the southern area in SPRIFMO. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you very much, Craig. Moving on to you, Tony. I have 2 questions here that I'll pull together for you. One is about the potential environmental impacts of deep sea fisheries and how can sustainable fishing practices be implemented to mitigate them. And the other one is there involvement of technology such as AI for the monitoring and control of deep sea fisheries or deep sea fisheries management measures? Thanks, Tony.
Right. Thanks, Esther, and thanks, Alpha, for these questions. Environmental impact of deep sea fisheries. It's difficult to separate out deep sea fisheries alone. There's kind of 3 types of fisheries in the high seas: the large pelagics, tuna, small pelagics, mackerel, herring, and the like, and the bottom fisheries, which we've been really talking about here. And it is important to emphasize that these all provide food for people to eat. So they all have a very positive purpose of providing food. Impacts vary according to the type of fishery. Of course, they're taking a target stock and they will affect that target stock. Sometimes, like with orange roughy, there were very high abundances, and those are much reduced, but they're much, much more productive. So although there's less fish, they grow very, very much quicker. So there is a compensation there. If we look at bycatch type species that are discarded, that are not wanted, we kind of put seabirds in that category, and there are mitigation measures that you can not throw offal over the side, food over the side, which will attract seabirds. There's certain torrey lines, tools that you can put that prevent seabirds from hitting trawl walks. And the same thing with deep water sharks. This is the area we're working on, and the really challenging area. You can also move into things a bit wider than that. The environmental impacts, we've focused on vulnerable marine ecosystems, but just making sure that the whole balance of the environment is maintained. And this is where we begin to overlap more and more with things like the work of the Conventional Biological Diversity, CBD, and the whole new BB&J process. So there's a bringing together very much on environmental impact assessments and controlling these. There's other things like plastics and carbon sequestration, carbon pollution, carbon footprints, but I won't go on to those, but there are wider impacts. The AI question is incredibly interesting because it's being used more and more and more. And we, as part of the project, are developing a smart identification key that will use AI to help observers identify the difficult to identify fish species such as deep water sharks. And although it's not my subject area, I'm sure AI is used very much in compliance and identifying risk and where we should focus our effort. So AI is increasingly used. So I hope that's answered your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony. And on the AI question, I don't know if Miguel or Craig would like to weigh in. Feel free to say no.
No, I think that the reply from Tony, clearly there is a big opportunity here to start assessing and analyzing the amount of data that we are collecting from all of our monitoring programs. One of the important things is to say that fisheries is one of the, and the different associated monitoring programs to fisheries is one of the platforms that collect more information about the ocean in general in many different aspects. No, so I believe that yes, we need to use this data better, and any tool, including artificial intelligence, that allows us to detect patterns and to identify priorities will definitely be a good addition to the methods that we are already using.
Thank you, Miguel. Okay, so let's move on to back to you, actually, Miguel. There are a few questions related to the MED. So we have one regarding the Scientific Observer Program on deep-sea fisheries to be implemented in the MED. How challenging do you envisage this might be? And who will be responsible for its implementation and enforcement? And who will be funding it? So quite an extensive question, if you'd like to address that.
Thank you, Esther. Yes, this is a very interesting and important question. In general, in the Mediterranean area, as I said at the beginning, a large percentage of our vessels are small-scale fisheries, and definitely it is very challenging to implement an effective program of observers on board for those vessels. However, as I said before, deep sea fishing in our area is constrained to very large vessels that usually are also targeting a very high price species. So there are vessels that are usually have good conditions. They are the ones that should be the priority to establish observers on board program, but also to establish any kind of better monitoring mechanism. We are testing actually with them not only the use of vessel monitoring systems on board, but also the use of automatic gear sensors that will allow to identify and to measure the catch in the net. And we are a bit optimistic on the fact that for these vessels and for these particular fisheries in which the vessels do have the conditions to have observers on board, this program should be implemented effectively. We are not yet there, and I think one of the challenges here is to move from this transitional phase of all of these management plans to this final adaptive management plan phase. For this final management plan phase, it will be important that countries agree at what are the minimal conditions for vessels to operate on these fisheries. And one of the conditions that have been said and repeated in our region is having these observers on board. We are currently doing this on a pilot phase on different fisheries. The European Union is already implementing this in some of their fleets as well, and we believe that this could be extended to all of these fleet segments, the deep sea fisheries one, fairly efficiently, we hope.
Thank you very much, Miguel. I will quickly address two questions myself. There was a question about whether the project only focuses on sharks, and does that mean all other deep sea species are excluded? And the very quick answer to that is absolutely not. We are obviously concerned about the whole ecosystem, including the target species and the retained and discarded non-target species. What the reason for the focus on sharks is because there's just very little data available globally on them right now, on deep water sharks. And we need to sort of improve reporting in order to know how many deep water sharks are caught, how many are retained, how many are thrown back overboard, how many survive, and what are basically the general impacts of deep sea fishing on deep water sharks. So the emphasis on the deep water sharks is really just to highlight that we really want to contribute to this missing information through this project. But obviously we are, of course, tackling deep sea fisheries from the entire ecosystem perspective. There was also another question: how are international regulations and governance mechanisms addressing the challenges of managing deep sea fisheries in the high seas? And what recent developments have occurred in this regard? I think this could take a long time to answer, so my best suggestion would be to please go to the e-learning course. Quite a lot of this is covered through the e-learning course that we have just developed. Now I'd like to come back to you, Tony. This is quite a big question, so perhaps in a very short way, if you could answer, with this review that you completed for the last 15 years after the adoption of the deep sea fisheries guidelines, where would you hope that we can be in 15 years from now? What would success look like?
Hopefully I'll still be working with FAO, so I think that will be success for me, and on these very important deep sea fisheries issues. I did in my presentation, I went from 2000 to current day, that's sort of 20 odd years. What has really changed? The stakeholders involved in the oceans has changed a lot. In the year 2000, it was really just a fisheries interest. Now it's almost everybody, and particularly biodiversity, deep sea mining. It's a real multi-stakeholder environment. So I would really like to see good cooperation between the different stakeholders, the different players in the oceans developed. And along with that, a rationalized spatial management of the oceans. We showed maps, or I showed maps, I think all of us showed maps. The oceans are managed spatially for fisheries. But when it comes to the wider use of the oceans, we still have challenges in getting people to work together. And I think that will be the big move. The BB&J is particularly strong on impact assessments, environmental impact assessments. So I think they will become much wider, much more open review of that. Partnerships, I think partnerships is what I would sum up in 15 years. And what we want our oceans to look like in the future. We know what they're like now, we know what they are in the past. What do we want them to look like in 15 or 20 years' time? How many fish do we want? How much do we want to catch? How many minerals? What biodiversity do we need to protect? So I think that's my short answer to that very good question. Thank you, Esther.
Thank you very much, Tony. And I think we can squeeze in one last question, very, very quick question to Craig. There was a question about seabird collisions with trawl cables. And basically the main question is whether there is data available on the levels of seabird interactions for the fisheries in the area, publicly available.
Yeah, I'm looking at, thanks Esther, I'm looking at the question. There's information available. Seabird collisions with trawl cables, net interactions are observed. And our measure, particularly our seabird measure, requires members to report annually on the mitigation measures that may be used by each vessel, as well as any observed seabird interaction data and the level of observer coverage focused on recording seabird bycatch. That information is generally found in the national reports, which are presented to the scientific committee. Again, that's on the website and the scientific. If you go to the scientific committee meetings, that's where the information is. And alongside that information is also a secretariat report that details all of the bycatch for the species of concern in SWFMO that have been caught by SWFMO fisheries. Species of concern in SWFMO includes things like marine mammals, marine reptiles, seabirds, and some species of shark and elasmobranchs. So there's a paper that the Secretariat produces every year to report on those level of bycatch, and again, that's available publicly. In terms of the question, I think I'll put a link in there in the question and answer thing just so that people can find it easily. I'm aware that there's a lot of information on the website and it can be hard to navigate if you're not familiar with it. But just to say that yes, there's definitely information being on recording those interactions. And there's information available, although it hasn't been collated out. Some of it will need to be pulled out of the individual national reports. Thanks. Thanks, Andrea, for the question, and thanks, Esther.
Thank you very much, Craig. And I was about to wrap up, but then a very interesting last question came through from Pablo about whether there's any cross-sectoral mechanism to address the impacts of non-fishing activities on VMEs. And Tony, if you can take 30 seconds to answer that, please.
Hi, Pablo. Yeah, this is a great question. And I think this is where I was hoping that we would be moving to in the next 15 years. There is a lot of opportunities for informal discussions between RFMOs and with whatever other sector it may be, which may be minerals, mining, shipping, whatever. Climate change is obviously something that can affect vulnerable marine ecosystems, and we would address that through our scientific committees. So I think that's where I see the future really developing, these improved cross-sectoral mechanisms. And Miguel from the Mediterranean has actually disappeared now, but I think the Mediterranean, the GFCM, probably have one of the better multi-stakeholder environments of any RFMO to talk about cross-sectoral activities. So I think they're a bit of a model for this. But it is a challenge. It does underpin the BB&J statement that each sector is responsible for its own, or there won't be, I've forgotten how it's worded now, but there won't be different interactions between the sectors, but there will be at the same time. So that's a quick answer. Thank you. Undermine regulations, that's it.
Thank you very much, Tony. And with that, we might have to wrap up our Q&A session. I would like to thank everyone for their very, very interesting questions and for their interaction with the panelists and for being here today. This has been tremendously interesting for us. And I hand it back to Christina. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to the excellent presenters and experts that have shared with us their insight. And many thanks to you, Esther, for your supervision throughout the process and for the excellent quality of the course. And I have to thank the participants because, believe me, this has been one of the most interactive sessions. I have never seen so many questions, very, very well targeted and very, very interesting. So I'd like to thank the participants really, and they hanged on till the end. So this is really, thank you very much. And please keep informed the FAO e-Learning Academy continues to deliver courses and webinars. So stay tuned. Bye-bye, everyone, and thank you.